Hi, my name is Lucas Bush, and this is my honors thesis, American Perceptions of Colombia as Shaped by Media, which, as it says, discusses the ways in which Colombia is understood by the American people, both as a culture and as a nation. So when you think of Colombia, you might think of cocaine, Shakira, soccer, or coffee. My goal in this project was to understand just how many of those assumptions are driven by American media and how real those perceptions might be for current college educated students. So in order to put this project together, I used a dual method system. One was a television and film analysis that looked at American made media, going back about 50 years to the present day. The other is a survey of SCU students, uh, and that was used to create a baseline for the current understanding of Colombia that we see in our society today. Um, these are the results of my two uh, methods. The first is here on the left. It is the timeline that I put together that included 6 case studies from the years 1984 until 2021 that talk a little bit about the different phases that Colombian representation in media has gone through. The first of which is what I titled Wilderness Without Borders, which is basically just a way of saying that films like Romancing the Stone tend to view Colombia as a backdrop for American characters to go in and just to have some sort of quote unquote exotic location. Um, so we think of Colombia in this sense as mostly a jungle with non English speakers that could basically be exchanged with any country in South America and to an extent any country in Africa or Southeast Asia, depending on the context of the movie or television show. So this is a phase where the fact that it is Colombia and the fact that Colombia is being called out as the location of these projects has nothing to do with Colombia itself. It has everything to do with just being able to put a label onto something. Then we move into what I call the mono-narco phase, which encapsulates much of the media that we think of when we think of Colombia. Narcos is perhaps the most famous example, but also things like Modern Family. Sofia Vergara's character in Modern Family is Colombian. And a lot of the jokes that happen within that show fall into this category, which is basically developed to say that cocaine and drugs and drug kingpins, drug running, are all essentially the only defining characteristic of Colombians. And that Colombia basically serves as a way to utilize storylines that have to do with drugs or sensationalist stories like Narcos that focus on real life drug kingpins like Pablo Escobar. All of this to say, mono-narco phase is still somewhat going into this day. There are definitely still examples of it in modern times, and that tends to be the largest motivator for Colombian representation in American media. The third phase is called transcending violence, and that's where we see films like Encanto, which came out just a couple years ago and shows a sort of new step, a step in the right direction. Now these characters and their stories are not focused on drugs or violence, but they tend to have violence as a sort of precursor to the story. Violence creates the context through which understandings and sort of stories about family and about belonging and identity can be told, but all of them still harken back to the violence in their past. So while violence and by proxy drugs are not necessarily the focus of these stories, they still influence the story in one way or another. On the right here, we see the results of, or one of the results of the survey that I put together. As we can see here, this is just a word cloud of a question where I asked survey respondents to list words that came to mind when they thought about Colombia. And I also put together 3 categories to group together all of the answers that I got over the course of the survey. One being non-specificity, which aligns nicely with the Wilderness Without Borders category of the previous results. Non-specificity, what I mean by that is that Colombia, as you can see here, is seen as sort of just a part of Latin America, a part of South America, somewhere that speaks Spanish. There's nothing particularly defining that comes out in a lot of the words that were used to describe Colombia, other than sort of general identity, geographical, sort of linguistic terms that could be applied to a variety of countries. The other category is music, which came up a lot in the questions that I asked my respondents, and that was actually the most surprising of all the results. Music from people like Shakira and Carol G has become a really big part of the way that Americans understand Colombia and consume Colombian exports. And lastly, drugs. Cocaine and the drug trade are still definitely defining characteristics of Colombia in the minds of many Americans. And so, as much as we would love to say that that phase of Colombian representation has ended, it unfortunately has not. And that will probably continue to be with us for years to come. So I was able to put together this project over the course of a year and a half here at SCU. And it's been amazing to be able to explore more about my own identity and learn more about the ways in which Americans understand other cultures outside of their own, and the role that media plays within sort of ethnic studies and foreign affairs. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a chance to read the paper.